Hello and welcome to this edition of The Interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons in Paris. My guest tonight is a man who's devoted more than 30 years of his life to humanitarian aid in parts of the world racked by conflict and natural and man-made disaster. A specialist in tropical medicine, Dr. Rony Brauman became the medical coordinator of Doctors Without Frontiers back in 1978, before becoming president of the organisation in 1982. Under his leadership, its operations increased massively, and Doctors Without Frontiers achieved an influence that extended beyond humanitarian aid. Dr. Rony Brauman, welcome to the interview.
Thank you.
You've been involved in aid and humanitarian work for more than 3 decades now, but what was it originally that persuaded you that this is where you should be working?
Well, I was curious. I'd been involved in a far-left group. I was an activist, and we were talking of third world issues, the third world as the future of mankind. And when, we got the hangover, when we recovered from this state of extremeness, so to speak, I remained, thirsty of some form of social justice, and curious about the third world, what was happening there, what did it look like. And as I was a doctor, as I had just become a doctor, I specialized in tropical medicine and emergencies. And, I left for Benin, then Djibouti, and then I joined MSF and went to Southeast Asia to work in refugees camp. But that was out of, intellectual and political curiosity. And then I got fond of the work I was doing. I loved practicing medicine in these conditions. It was absolutely fascinating, very rewarding, and then I carried on.
And then in 1982 you became president of MSF.
Yes.
And made substantial changes. The organisation grew enormously by something like 10 times. Your budget increased enormously as well. What lay behind the thinking to the changes you made to the organisation?
Well, the main idea is that we had to get organized. When I became the president of Médecins Sans Frontières, it was a tiny, small group. We had one person, a few person on wages. Our HQ was not larger than this room, but the context was extremely positive for humanitarian and human rights groups. People were very curious, very supportive of any kind of action which was, besides larger political frames, and which was, hands-on, field work, concrete operations. So I think that what MSF achieved very quickly, and I think what the merits, the credits of the group I was leading at the time is that we understood that we had to rely on our own forces, which means, that's an old Maoist say, but of course it's a kind of joke. But still, it means something. It meant something in the state of mind where we stood at the time. Establish logistical means, a technical support, follow-up of the field teams, and so on. So we grew up and up. And,
did becoming a much bigger organisation raise issues for you that hadn't existed before? I mean, I remember as a field reporter working in places like Chechnya, for instance, where you would come across Médecins Sans Frontières everywhere. In fact, as a journalist, you frequently came to rely on Médecins Sans Frontières for a point of view. So were there issues that suddenly, as a consequence of your size, that suddenly started pressing on you as an organizer?
Maybe, as our main field of action was armed conflicts and refugees, armed conflicts and the consequences of armed conflict, whether it be famines, epidemics, refugees camps, and that can be the three at a time. I mean, a famine and an epidemic can break out in a refugee camp. So that's the general framing of our work. Of course, we came across a number of observers, namely journalists, and we became a source of information, which is not our goal, which is not our role. But well, we can speak about what we see around us, but we don't give general diagnosis about the situation, who is right, who is wrong, what is the balance of forces, and these kind of things. That's not our job.
In theory, at least. In practice, it's not always like that, though, is it?
Yes, you're right. In practice, it's not always as in theory. In practice, we can come out denouncing massive human rights violations. We don't accept to be passive and mute witnesses of massive exactions unless other observers like journalists or human rights groups get on the field and describe the situation and ring the bell and, well, let people know what's happening on the ground. But if we are by ourselves, yes, we have to speak out to, well, maybe sometimes to denounce, or at least to inform. We want to share the burden with others, like when we were in Congo, like 10 years ago. We were absolutely alone there, witnessing massacres in Congo, Brazzaville. Well, we came
then
out.
Speaking out becomes a moral issue.
Yes, it became a moral issue, yes.
How thin is the dividing line between humanitarian work and politics, do you think?
Oh, well, it's not that thin. It's a thick. it's a thick line. Of course, sometimes we cross the line, maybe without us knowing it. But generally speaking, it's quite clear. We don't recommend, we don't prescribe any kind of solution to conflict. We abstain from taking sides in a conflict. We abstain from prescribing or calling for an armed intervention like it is discussed now about, it's been discussed about Darfur for some months now. We stick to our main job, which is to be humanitarian doctors working for all those who are in need because of a major crisis, not because there is a sort of under-medicalized situation. There's not enough doctor, not enough medical problem in general, but in situations of crisis where our status of expatriate puts us in a privileged position to talk to all the belligerent parties, to bring medical relief to all those or to most of those who need it, then that's where we work. In this predicament, I don't think we are political, and what is rather...
And yet there are some governments who feel that you don't draw the line between humanitarian work and politics thickly enough.
Yes, maybe when we denounce massive abuses, maybe they think we are going political.
The Russian government, for instance.
Maybe, yes, maybe the Russian government, yes. Mostly the Russian government for what we said about Chechnya, and that applies also to other human rights and humanitarian groups, but because the Russian government wanted to just crush the insurgency in Chechnya without any foreign witness. So that's the reason why he accused us of being political, which was not the case. We haven't say anything about what should be the future of Chechnya, but we've said what was the present of Chechnya, which was massive bombing, hundreds of thousands of people being crushed under carpet bombings, massive torture, displacements of population, and this kind of exactions.
If I could switch forward to the present now, you've courted controversy recently by criticising many of those who you say are exaggerating the situation in Darfur. Clearly, they don't agree with you. What is the basis of your position?
Well, the basis of my position and Médecins Sans Frontières' position and all relief humanitarian groups on the ground, that has to be recalled because it's quite important. Our position is that an foreign armed intervention imposed by force to the Sudanese government would bring more harm than good, would trigger more violence.
Even the United Nations force?
Well, if it's accepted by the Sudanese government, which seems to be the case.
To be happening, yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay, that's not a problem. The issue was, should we intervene by force, sending troops in a position of combat against the Sudanese army? That was the issue. And Médecins Sans Frontières and a number of humanitarian NGOs had to speak publicly about this issue because humanitarian rhetorics was mobilized to justify this armed intervention. Everything, I mean, those who were supporters of this project of armed intervention were speaking as humanitarian groups, saying, well, we've got to protect relief workers on the ground, to protect the civilian population which is massacred by fanatic herds who just swept across the Darfur, hyping the situation, speaking of genocide, which is not something which has happened in Darfur. So we had to recall some facts to describe the current reality.
But not everybody agrees with you on the facts. If I could just refer to Jackie Mamou, the former president of Doctors of the World, and Jean-Christophe Ruffin, president of Action Against Hunger, say almost 500,000 people have been forced from their homes since May last year.
Yes, I don't know where they take those figures from, but that's not the problem. That's a problem. I mean, there is a critical problem in Darfur. I would be the last to deny this fact, of course. The thing is, can we solve the problem through armed intervention? That's the issue. And I'm sorry, Jackie Mamou and Jean-Christophe Ruffin and many people who are involved in, by the way, Action contre la faim, Action Against Hunger, agrees that there should not be an armed intervention. Ruffin is a former president of Action contre la faim. All the relief groups on the ground disagree with this position. All the relief groups think that things have settled, that the main issue now is massive, widespread insecurity. That's a real problem, causing like between 100 and 200 deaths per month, which is way too much, but which is far from 10,000 per month that we had like 3 years ago. So things have changed in Darfur, and those people seem not to have seen that things have been changing for like 2 to 3 years. And well, Save Darfur in the United States and La Coalition Darfur in France are siding along to advocate, to call for an armed intervention, speaking of genocide, the first genocide in the 21st century. And I think that this is not what's happening on the ground. And I insist that absolutely all, with no exception, humanitarian relief organizations on the ground disagree with this diagnosis and with this prescription. And all UN agencies, all researchers, all specialized observers of the region. So there is a movement, Save Darfur. And
a decision, I suppose, has to be made at some point about what point you go beyond humanitarian aid, what point you say the politics have become impossible. For instance, we've had Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa saying the situation has reached that point. It is such a serious state at the moment that humanitarian aid can't achieve very much. Political decisions have to be made, hard political decisions.
Well, with all due respect, I think that Archbishop Desmond Tutu is mistaken. Of course, the situation is critical. I'm not denying this. The issue now is to understand and prepare the repatriation of these 2 million internally displaced persons. It's something to supply this huge population, and it's obvious that they won't. I mean, it's impossible that they stay in this situation. So we are in a critical situation, but not of a critical violence situation, but of a human and social critical condition.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this edition of The Interview. Thanks to Rony Brauman, the ex-president of Médecins Sans Frontières. Join us again soon on The Interview. Bonsoir.